When I left the orphanage, they said I inherited a sealed distillery. What I built there changed everything. If you've ever felt like your past was a locked door, I hope you'll stick around for this story. Maybe even subscribe, because we're all just trying to find the right key. The day I turned 18 was the day I ceased to exist, at least according to the state of Oregon. My file was closed, my bed was stripped, and my name was removed from the dinner roster at the St. Jude's group home for boys. 18 years of being a ward, a case number, a problem to be managed, and it all ended not with a bang, but with a cardboard box and a handshake from Mr. Abernathy, the home's director. The box held everything I owned: 3 pairs of jeans, a handful of shirts, a worn copy of a book I'd read 100 times, and a faded photograph of a woman I was told was my mother. She was smiling, but her eyes looked tired. Mr. Abernathy's handshake was dry and brief. His office smelled of industrial-strength cleaner and quiet desperation. "Well, Leo," he said, adjusting his tie, "you've made it. The world is yours now." It didn't feel like it. It felt like I was being pushed off a cliff with a polite smile. He slid a thick manila envelope across his polished desk. It had my full name on it, Leo Sterling, typed in a severe, blocky font. "This came for you, from a law firm. We were instructed to give it to you on your 18th birthday. No sooner." I picked it up. It was heavy, heavier than paper had any right to be. "A law firm?" I asked. My voice sounded small in the big, empty room. My history with official documents was a litany of placements, evaluations, and disciplinary reports. Nothing good ever came in a manila envelope. "That's all I know," he said, already turning to a stack of papers on his desk. His part in my life officially concluded. "There's a bus ticket in there and some cash. Instructions, I imagine. Good luck, son." The word son felt hollow, a placeholder for a relationship that never existed. I stood there for a moment, the box under one arm, the envelope in my hand, a ghost in the place that had been my only home. The silence in the hallway was louder than the usual cacophony of shouts and running feet. I was already forgotten. I walked out the heavy front doors for the last time, the cool morning air hitting my face like a slap. Freedom felt a lot like being adrift in a cold, gray ocean. I found a bench at the bus stop and carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a bus ticket to downtown Portland, $500 bills clipped together, and a letter on thick, creamy letterhead. Sloan, Albright, and Finch, attorneys at law. The letter was brief and formal. It requested my presence at their office to discuss the final dispensation of the estate of one Arthur Sterling, my grandfather. A man I only knew as a name on a form, the one who had surrendered me to the state after my mother's death. He had died 2 years ago, a fact no one had bothered to tell me. The letter also mentioned an inheritance. It spoke of a property, a business, and a set of keys. I looked at the $500. It was more money than I had ever held in my life. It felt like a test. I could take it and disappear, try to start a new life somewhere anonymous. It was tempting. The thought of walking into a law firm, of being judged by men in expensive suits, made my stomach clench. But the name, Arthur Sterling, echoed in my mind. He was a phantom, a question mark that had defined my entire existence. Why did he give me up? Why did he leave me anything at all? The money wasn't an escape. It was a summons. I folded the letter, put the cash in my pocket, and waited for the bus that would take me toward an answer. Or maybe just a bigger question. The city rose up to meet me, a forest of glass and steel that felt just as impersonal as the institution I'd left behind. The lawyer's office was on the 30th floor of a skyscraper that seemed to pierce the perpetual gray sky. The elevator ride was silent and smooth, my reflection in the polished brass walls looking pale and out of place. My worn jacket and scuffed boots were a stark contrast to the quiet luxury of the lobby. The law office of Sloan, Albright, and Finch was a world of hushed tones, dark wood, and the faint, pleasant smell of old books and money. A receptionist with a polite, impenetrable smile directed me to a conference room overlooking the city. The view was staggering. The entire world seemed to be laid out below, a grid of cars and people moving with a purpose I couldn't fathom. I felt like I was looking at a different planet. A few minutes later, a man in a perfectly tailored gray suit entered. He was older, with silver hair and kind eyes that seemed to hold a hint of weariness. "Mr. Sterling, I'm Robert Finch." His handshake was firm, warmer than Mr. Abernathy's. "Please, sit. Can I get you anything? Coffee? Water?" I just shook my head, my throat too tight to speak. I sat in a leather chair that was probably worth more than my entire cardboard box of possessions. He sat opposite me, placing a thick, leather-bound folder on the vast mahogany table between us. He opened it slowly, with a practiced, deliberate motion. "Leo," he began, his tone gentle but serious. "I was your grandfather's lawyer for over 20 years. I was also his friend. Before he passed, he gave me very specific instructions regarding you." He paused, looking at me as if trying to gauge my reaction. "He was a complicated man. I want you to know that." I nodded, my gaze fixed on the folder. "He gave me up." It wasn't a question. It was the one solid fact I had about him. Finch's expression didn't change. "He did. He believed it was the only way to keep you safe." That sentence hung in the air, nonsensical. Safe from what? Safer than a childhood spent in the sterile, loveless arms of the state. I felt a flash of anger, hot and sharp, but I pushed it down. I was here to listen. "As per his will," Finch continued, "you are his sole heir. He has left you his property. It's located in a town called Redemption, about a 3-hour drive west of here, near the coast. It's a distillery, or it was." He slid a set of photographs across the table. They were recent, glossy. The first showed a large, imposing brick building, its windows boarded up, a massive steel door bearing a heavy, rusted chain and padlock. Weeds grew thick and high around its foundation. The sign above the door, barely legible, read, "Sterling & Son, Artisanal Spirits." The second photo showed a small, dilapidated cottage next to the main building, its porch sagging and its paint peeling. "The Sterling & Son Distillery has been closed and sealed for nearly 16 years, Finch explained. "Arthur shut it down right after your mother passed away. He never reopened it." He then slid a different set of papers toward me. These were not glossy. They were covered in red ink and threatening legal headings. "Unfortunately, the inheritance is not a simple one. The property carries a significant amount of debt. Back taxes, mostly. They've accumulated for years. A development corporation, Pacific Horizon Holdings, has already paid a portion of that debt to the county, placing a lien on the property. They want the land. They've made an offer." He named a figure. It sounded enormous to me, a fortune. Enough to go anywhere, do anything. "They are willing to pay you that amount for the deed. You walk away, debt-free, with a substantial sum of money. You would be set for a new start." It was the easy way out. The same choice I'd had at the bus stop, but bigger, more final. Take the money and run. Forget the crumbling building and the name Sterling. Forget the ghost of the man who abandoned me. And the other option? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Finch looked at me, his gaze steady. The other option is you take on the property and the debt. Pacific Horizon will likely move to foreclose. You would have to find a way to pay back the lien plus the remaining taxes within a very short time frame, 90 days to be exact. If you fail, you lose the property and walk away with nothing. He leaned forward slightly. Leo, I have to be honest with you. This is not a viable option for most people, let alone a young man in your position. The building is a ruin. The debt is substantial. Taking the offer is the sensible choice. It's what Arthur, in his more practical moments, would have wanted for you. But there was a hesitation in his voice, a flicker of something in his eyes that told me there was more. He was my friend, Finch repeated softly, and he was not always a practical man. He loved that place. He poured his life into it. He pushed a small, heavy iron key across the table. It was old, ornate. This is for the cottage on the property. The distillery itself is sealed. Arthur sealed it himself. I don't know why, and I don't have the key. He then handed me another envelope, this one smaller and unsealed. Inside was another bus ticket, this one to Redemption, and the rest of the cash from the initial 500. Your grandfather left one final instruction. He asked that you go there, that you see it for yourself before you make any decision. The choice felt immense, a crossroads that would define the rest of my life. One path led to a clean, easy future, a life unburdened by a past I didn't understand. The other led to a ruin, to debt, to a fight I was almost certain to lose. But it also led to Arthur Sterling. It led to the place he loved. It led to the sealed door. I picked up the iron key. It felt cold and heavy in my palm, a solid piece of a forgotten story. I'll go, I said. I have to see it. Finch nodded slowly, a faint, sad smile on his lips. I thought you might. The bus ride to Redemption was a journey back in time. The city's sleek, modern towers gave way to sprawling suburbs, then to farmland, and finally to the dense, dripping forests of the Oregon Coast Range. The sky was a uniform sheet of gray, the clouds so low they seemed to snag on the tops of the towering Douglas firs. Rain began to fall, not a downpour, but a steady, persistent drizzle that blurred the world outside my window into a watercolor of greens and grays. It was a landscape that felt ancient and melancholy, a perfect match for my own mood. With every mile that passed, the weight of Robert Finch's words settled heavier on me. A ruin, a substantial debt, a 90-day clock. I was chasing a ghost into a trap. Every rational part of my brain, the part that had been honed by years of navigating the indifferent logic of the system, told me to get off at the next stop, turn around, and take the money. But the image of that sealed distillery, of the name Sterling and Son fading above the door, had taken root in my mind. It was the only tangible link I had to a family, to a history that wasn't written in a social worker's file. Son. The sign had said Sterling and Son. Who was the son? My father? An uncle? The questions were a current pulling me forward, stronger than the tide of common sense. The bus finally hissed to a stop in what appeared to be the center of Redemption. The town was little more than a wide spot in the road, a collection of tired-looking buildings huddled together against the encroaching forest. A general store with a flickering neon sign, a tavern with blacked-out windows, a gas station with old-fashioned pumps, and a post office. That was it. The handful of other passengers who got off with me dispersed quickly, melting into the misty afternoon, leaving me alone on the wet pavement. I pulled my jacket tighter, the damp air seeping into my bones. There was a payphone outside the general store, a relic from another era. I could call Finch right now, tell him I'd made a mistake, tell him to accept the offer. Instead, I walked into the general store. The bell above the door chimed a cheerful, out-of-place sound. The air inside was warm and smelled of coffee, sawdust, and damp wool. An old man with a magnificent white beard sat behind the counter, reading a newspaper. He looked up over his spectacles as I entered. "Afternoon," he grunted. "Afternoon," I replied. "I'm looking for the old Sterling Distillery." His eyes narrowed slightly, a flicker of something, curiosity, maybe pity, in his gaze. "That's a place no one's looked for in a long time. It's about a mile down the old coast road. Can't miss it. Big, ugly brick thing sitting all by itself. Hasn't been open since Art Sterling locked it up." He folded his newspaper. "You family?" "His grandson," I said. The words felt strange on my tongue. The man nodded slowly. "Figured. You've got his eyes." He paused. "Folks from some big company have been sniffing around that property, offering folks money for their opinions on a new resort." He pointed a thumb out the window. "They're the ones you want to talk to, son. Not much left for anyone out at that old place but ghosts and bad memories." His warning echoed the lawyer's. I bought a bottle of water and a stale granola bar, the only things I could afford to waste money on. The walk down the old coast road was quiet and lonely. The drizzle had picked up, and the pavement was cracked and slick. The forest crowded the road, the air thick with the smell of wet earth and pine. And then I saw it. It was set back from the road, exactly as it looked in the photographs, but bigger, more imposing, more desolate. The brick was dark with age and moisture, streaked with green moss. The boarded-up windows looked like vacant eyes. The sheer size of it was intimidating. It wasn't just a building, it was a fortress, a tomb. The words Sterling and Son were barely visible, ghosts of a forgotten ambition. Next to it, the cottage looked small and fragile, a forgotten afterthought. Its porch sagged so severely it looked like it was kneeling in defeat. I walked up the overgrown path, my boots sinking into the soft, muddy ground. The air was heavy, still. The only sound was the steady drip of water from the trees. I stood before the cottage door, the old iron key in my hand. It felt like I was about to intrude on something sacred, something that had been left to rest. My heart was pounding. This was it, the beginning of the answer. I slid the cold, heavy key into the lock. It resisted at first, stiff with rust and disuse. I put my shoulder into it, turning with all my strength. With a loud, groaning click, the lock gave way. The door swung inward on a single protesting hinge, opening into a wall of darkness that smelled of dust, decay, and time itself. I stepped inside, leaving the gray light of the afternoon behind. The air in the cottage was cold and thick, clinging to my skin like a damp shroud. Dust motes danced in the single shaft of light that pierced the gloom from a grimy window. Every surface was coated in a thick, uniform layer of gray. It was like stepping into a photograph from 100 years ago. The layout was simple. A small living area, a tiny kitchen, and a single bedroom off to the side. The furniture was still there, draped in dusty white sheets, their forms like sleeping animals in the dim light. It was a place frozen in time, abandoned in a hurry. A half-empty coffee cup sat on the kitchen counter, a ghostly ring of brown at its bottom. A newspaper from 16 years ago lay folded on a small table. I walked through the rooms slowly, my footsteps echoing in the profound silence. This was where he had lived, Arthur Sterling, my grandfather. I tried to imagine him here, sitting in the lumpy armchair, looking out the window at the distillery that was his life's work. What had he been thinking in those final days before he locked it all away? I ran my hand along the back of a wooden chair, my fingers leaving a clean streak in the dust. There was no sense of a person here anymore, just the oppressive weight of their absence. In the bedroom, a simple iron bed frame stood against the far wall, stripped of its mattress. A small wooden dresser was beside it, its drawers all slightly ajar, empty. It felt like the whole place had been methodically purged of anything personal, anything that might tell a story. It was just a shell. Disappointment settled in my stomach, cold and heavy. I had come all this way for nothing, just an empty house and a mountain of debt. The sensible choice, Finch had said. Take the money. The words echoed in my head, mocking me. I was about to turn and leave, to walk back to town and make that call, when my foot caught on something. The floorboards in the bedroom were rough, unfinished planks. One of them, near the wall under the window, was slightly raised. I knelt, my fingers tracing its edge. It was loose. My heart began to beat faster. It wasn't a mistake. It was deliberate. Using my fingertips, I pried at the edge of the board. It resisted, then lifted with a soft, scraping sound. Beneath it was a dark, hollow space. And in that space, nestled in the dirt and darkness, was a metal box. It was an old army surplus ammunition can, painted olive drab, its clasps rusted shut. It wasn't large, but it was heavy. I lifted it out. It was cold to the touch. I carried it into the main room, setting it on the sheet-draped table, sending up a cloud of dust. For a long moment, I just stared at it. This was it. This had to be it. The reason he'd sent me here. The rust on the clasps was thick. I had to use the heel of my boot to break them open. They popped with a sharp metallic crack that sounded like a gunshot in the silent cottage. I lifted the lid. The air that escaped smelled of old paper, leather, and something else. Something faint and vaguely sweet, like dried tobacco and whiskey. Inside there were no valuables, no secret stash of money. It was filled with letters, dozens of them, bundled together with twine. They were addressed to me. For Leo was written on the top envelope in a strong, slanted hand. Beneath the letters was a thick, leather-bound journal, and under that, wrapped in oilcloth, was another key. This one was different from the cottage key. It was larger, more industrial, made of brass. It had a single, strange-looking tooth. This had to be the key to the distillery, to the sealed door. My hands were shaking as I picked up the first envelope. The paper was thick and brittle with age. I opened it and unfolded the single sheet inside. The letter was dated just a few days after he had surrendered me to the state. "Leo," it began, "if you are reading this, then I am gone, and you have come back. I hope you are a man now, and I hope the world has been kinder to you than I was. I know you must hate me. You have every right to. I want to tell you why, not for my sake, but for yours. You need to know that you were not abandoned. You were protected. I sat down on a dusty, sheet-covered chair, the ammunition box on my lap, the weight of 16 years of silence resting in my hands. The drizzle outside had turned into a steady rain, drumming a soft, mournful rhythm on the cottage roof. I began to read. The letters, read one after another in the fading light of the cottage, painted a picture of a man I never knew and a life I could barely imagine. Arthur Sterling was not the monster I had conjured in my mind. He was a man cornered by love and desperation. "Your mother, Eleanor," he wrote in one of the first letters, "was the brightest thing in this world. She had a laugh that could make the rain stop. But she had a darkness in her too, a sickness that the doctors had no name for back then. It pulled her toward people who were no good for her. Your father was one of them. He wasn't a bad man, not really, just weak. He got himself tangled up with the wrong sort of people, borrowed money from men who don't take kindly to late payments." The story unfolded, each letter adding another layer of grim detail. The wrong sort of people were a local crime outfit, running loan sharking and smuggling operations up and down the coast. When my father couldn't pay his debt, they came after him. He disappeared, leaving my mother and me behind to face his mess. "They came to the distillery," Arthur wrote. "They told me my son's debt was now my debt. They threatened Eleanor. They threatened you. You were just a baby, Leo. You had her smile. I looked at you, and I knew I would do anything to keep you safe. Anything." His solution was a deal with the devil. He was a master distiller, one of the best in the state, even then. His small batch whiskey was legendary among those who knew. The criminals saw an opportunity. They didn't want his money, they wanted his skill. The deal was simple, the next letter explained. I would continue to run the distillery legally during the day, but at night a portion of my output, the best of it, would go to them. No labels, no taxes, no questions asked. They would move it through their own channels. In exchange, they would forgive my son's debt and leave my family alone. I became their private label. My craft became their commodity. I hated every moment of it, but every time I looked at you and Eleanor, I knew I had no other choice. For a few years, the arrangement worked. The distillery, Sterling and Son, thrived on paper. But the son on the sign was a lie, a tribute to a lost boy and a constant reminder of the secret it concealed. Arthur was a prisoner in his own business, his passion turned into a source of shame. Then my mother got sick. Her darkness, as he called it, consumed her. After she died, Arthur was alone with me, a toddler, and a dangerous secret. "They came back," he wrote, the handwriting in this letter shakier, more frantic. With Eleanor gone, they saw a new opportunity. They wanted more. They wanted to use the distillery to move other things I couldn't stomach. I refused. I told them our deal was over. They laughed at me. They said the deal was over when they said it was over. They looked at you, playing on the floor with your wooden blocks, and they said, "That's a fine-looking boy. It would be a shame if he grew up without a grandfather, too." That was the breaking point. He knew he couldn't protect me anymore, not while I was with him. The only way to get me out of their reach was to cut me out of his life completely. He made the hardest decision of his life. He called Child Protective Services. "I made them believe I was an unfit guardian," he wrote, the papers stained with what could have been a teardrop. "I said I was a drunk, that I couldn't cope. It was the most convincing performance of my life, because every word felt like the truth. Letting you go tore my soul in two, Leo. The day they took you, I watched the car drive away until it was just a dot on the horizon. Then I came back here, to the distillery, and I sealed it. I welded the main door shut from the inside and climbed out a back window. I chained it up and walked away. I let it fall into ruin, letting the debt and the taxes pile up like a wall around it. It was my penance, and it was my last act of protection. As long as it was a worthless, debt-ridden ruin, they would have no use for it, and they would have no reason to ever look for you. I had to stop reading. The small cottage was pitch black now, the rain a constant, roaring presence. I couldn't see the words anymore, but I didn't need to. They were burned into my mind. I wasn't abandoned. I was saved. My entire life, the narrative I had built around my own victimhood, was a lie. The emptiness, the years in the home, the feeling of being unwanted, it was all the cost of my safety. It was the price of his love. I leaned my head back against the dusty wall, and I cried. I cried for the baby who was taken from his home. I cried for the young boy who spent years wondering what he did wrong. I cried for my mother and the father I never knew. But mostly, I cried for Arthur Sterling, the lonely old man who sacrificed everything, who chose a life of solitude and regret just so his grandson could have a life at all. The weight of his sacrifice was crushing, a debt far greater than any amount of money owed to the county. The letters didn't end there. The last few were written recently, in the final years of his life. His health was failing, and he knew his time was short. "The world has changed, Leo," he wrote. "Those men, their organization, it's mostly gone now. Broken up by the feds years ago. The immediate danger has passed, but the land is valuable now. Developers are circling like vultures, and the debt I built as a shield has become a weapon they can use against you. Robert Finch will tell you about their offer. He will tell you to take the money and run. It is the logical choice. It will give you the clean start I always wanted for you." He continued, "But there is another choice, the harder one. Inside this distillery, locked away from the world, is my legacy. Not the tainted product I made for them, but my real work, my life's work. The recipes are in my journal, the methods, the secrets. I sealed it all away, waiting for you. If you choose it, the fight will be hard. You will have to beat the vultures and the bean counters. You will have to build something from the ruin I left behind. But the choice must be yours. Freedom with a pocketful of cash, or a home built on a foundation of sacrifice. I don't know which is right. I only know that I love you." I found the leather journal at the bottom of the box. It was filled with his elegant script, detailing mash bills, fermentation times, and aging techniques. It was a master class in distillation. And at the very bottom of the box, beneath the journal, was one last thing, a small, flat envelope. Inside was not a letter, but a collection of photographs. A smiling young woman holding a baby, my mother and me. A younger Arthur, his arm around her, standing proudly in front of the distillery, the sign, "Sterling and Son," bright and new. And a final photo of just me as a toddler, sitting on his lap, his face a portrait of pure, unguarded love. The choice wasn't a choice at all, not anymore. Taking the money would mean invalidating his sacrifice. It would mean agreeing that his life's work, his legacy, was worthless. It would mean leaving him buried under the ruins for good. I couldn't do it. This place wasn't just a property, it was a story. It was my story, and it wasn't over yet. Listen, if you've made it this far into the story, something in it must be resonating with you. Maybe you've had to deal with a difficult inheritance, not of money or property, but of family secrets and hard choices. It's a heavy thing to carry. I'm building a community here for people who get it, for people who know that sometimes the most valuable things are the ones that ask the most of us. If that's you, consider hitting that subscribe button. It means a lot to know you're out there. Now, let's get back to what happened next, because making the choice was one thing. Surviving it was another. The next morning, I woke up stiff and cold on the floor of the cottage, the empty ammunition box beside me. The rain had stopped, and a weak, watery sunlight was filtering through the dirty windows. The world felt quiet, washed clean. My decision from the night before hadn't wavered in the harsh light of day. It felt even more solid, more real. I had a purpose for the first time in my life. I wasn't just Leo, the orphan. I was Leo Sterling, and I had a legacy to reclaim. My first move was to call Robert Finch. I walked the mile back into town, my mind racing with plans and possibilities, the heavy brass key in my pocket, a constant, reassuring weight. The old man at the general store gave me a curious look as I walked in, but he just nodded toward the payphone. I fed coins into the slot, my hands trembling slightly as I dialed the number from memory. "Finch," he answered on the first ring. "It's Leo Sterling," I said, my voice stronger than it had been in his office. "Leo, I was wondering when you'd call. Did you see the property? I assume you're ready to accept the offer from Pacific Horizon. I have the paperwork ready." "No," I said, the word sharp and clear. "I'm not accepting their offer. I'm keeping the property." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I could almost hear him processing it, weighing the implications. "Leo," he finally said, his voice laced with concern, "we need to be realistic. The lien is over $60,000. The remaining back taxes are another 30. You have less than 90 days to come up with nearly $100,000. Where are you going to get that kind of money?" "I don't know yet," I admitted. "But my grandfather didn't leave me a ruin. He left me a key. He left me his work. I have to try." Another pause. "His work?" Finch asked, a note of intrigue in his voice. "Leo, what did you find out there?" I told him everything. About the hidden box, the letters, the story of the extortion, the sacrifice, the sealed distillery. I told him about the journal filled with recipes. As I spoke, I felt the story solidifying, becoming not just a family tragedy, but a plan of action. When I finished, Finch was quiet for a moment. "My God," he whispered. "Arthur never told me the specifics. He only ever said he had to shut it down to protect his family. I never imagined. Leo, this changes things. It doesn't change the money you owe, but it changes the nature of the fight." His tone had shifted from pragmatic concern to something else. Advocacy. He was on my side. Pacific Horizon has been playing this as a simple land grab, assuming they were dealing with an abandoned property and an inexperienced kid who would take the first offer. They don't know what's really there. We can use that. "What do we do?" I asked. "First, I'll file a motion to contest the lien. It won't stop the clock, but it will bog them down in paperwork and buy us a little time. It signals that we're not rolling over. Second, you need to get inside that distillery. You need to find out exactly what your grandfather meant when he said he left his real work in there. If there's something of value, something we can leverage, it could be our only shot." After the call, I felt a surge of adrenaline. It was me and Finch against the world. I walked back to the property, not with the trepidation of the day before, but with a sense of ownership. This was mine. The crumbling brick, the sagging roof, the weeds, all of it. I stood before the massive sealed steel door. The chain was as thick as my wrist, the padlock a chunk of rusted iron. There was no way I was getting through that without heavy equipment. I walked the perimeter of the building, my eyes scanning for another way in. for the back window my grandfather had mentioned climbing out of. The rear of the distillery was even more overgrown, a jungle of blackberry bushes and ivy. I spent the better part of the afternoon with a rusty sickle I found in a collapsed shed, hacking my way through the thorns and vines. My hands were bleeding and my arms ached, but I was relentless. Finally, I found it. About 15 feet up the brick wall was a single window, not boarded up like the others, but covered with a sheet of rusted metal that had been bolted into the brickwork. It was too high to reach. I needed a ladder. I spent the rest of the day cleaning the cottage, fueled by a desperate, hopeful energy. I threw open the windows, letting the fresh, damp air chase out the stale smell of decay. I beat the dust from the sheets, scrubbed the floors, and washed the lone coffee cup. It was a small, symbolic act of reclamation. I was breathing life back into this place, starting with this little corner of it. That night, sleeping on the floor again, I read Arthur's journal. It was dense, scientific, and poetic all at once. He wrote about yeast strains like they were old friends, about the character of the local water, about how the coastal fog influenced the aging process in the barrels. This wasn't just a recipe book, it was a philosophy. His passion was infectious, a spark that ignited my own determination. The next day, I walked back into town. I needed a ladder, and I needed a job. I had less than $400 to my name. I went back to the general store. The old man, whose name I learned was Hank, was there again. "Back again," he observed. "You decide to take the money?" "No," I said. "I'm staying. I need a ladder, and maybe some work, if there's any to be had." Hank stared at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he let out a short, huffing laugh. "You're as stubborn as he was. Arthur, I mean. He never knew when to quit either." He gestured with his thumb. "Got an old extension ladder out back you can borrow? As for work, I might have some odd jobs. Stocking shelves, sweeping up. Won't make you rich, but it'll pay for food." It was a start. I spent the next week working for Hank in the mornings, my world shrinking to the simple, satisfying tasks of stocking cans and hauling boxes. The people of Redemption were quiet, reserved. They watched me with a sort of wary curiosity. I was a ghost from the town's past, a sterling come back to haunt the old distillery. But Hank's acceptance, however grudging, seemed to be a signal to the others. A nod from a waitress at the tavern, a hello from the postman. I was no longer a complete outsider. In the afternoons, I worked at the distillery. I dragged the heavy ladder to the back of the building and set it against the wall. Climbing it was terrifying. It swayed and creaked with every step. At the top, I braced myself and went to work on the metal plate covering the window. The bolts were rusted solid. I used a wrench from Hank's tool collection, putting all my weight into it. For hours, all I heard was the screech of metal on metal. Finally, with a groan of protest, the first bolt gave way, then the second, and the third. The last one snapped, and the heavy metal sheet fell away, crashing into the bushes below. I peered into the darkness. The air that flowed out was cool and smelled incredible, of old oak, grain, and something sweet and complex, the ghost of 1,000 barrels of whiskey. I pulled myself up and through the narrow opening, dropping into the silent, cavernous space of the Sterling and Son distillery. I landed on a catwalk, my boots kicking up a cloud of dust that was somehow different from the dust in the cottage. This dust was finer, fragrant with the spirit that had once been made here. The interior of the distillery was breathtaking. It was a cathedral of industry. A massive copper pot still, tarnished to a dark green, stood in the center of the main floor like an altar. Fermentation tanks, made of massive timbers, lined one wall. The place was silent, motionless, but it felt alive, brimming with potential. It wasn't a ruin, it was dormant. I made my way down a set of iron stairs to the main floor. My grandfather had been meticulous. Everything was cleaned, drained, and covered. The equipment was old, but it looked solid, well-maintained, even in its long sleep. He hadn't abandoned his work in anger. He had preserved it with care. According to his journal, the real treasure wasn't the equipment. It was the barrels. He wrote of a special project, his Eleanor Reserve, a small batch of his finest whiskey, distilled just before my mother died. He had stored it in a special section of the aging cellar, a place he had walled off before he sealed the distillery. It was his masterpiece, he wrote, the one perfect thing he had ever made. He believed that after 16 years of aging in the unique coastal climate, it would be something truly extraordinary. I found the cellar door. It was thick oak, and like the main entrance, it was locked. But this time, I had the key. The strange industrial brass key from the ammunition box. I slid it into the lock. It was a perfect fit. With a heavy, satisfying clunk, the lock turned. I pulled the door open and was met with a wave of cool, damp air, so rich with the smell of aging whiskey it was almost intoxicating. The smell of angels' share, 16 years of it. The cellar was dark. I used the flashlight on a cheap phone I'd bought. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing rows upon rows of oak barrels, stacked high on wooden racks. They were all covered in a thick black mold, a sign of a perfect aging environment. At the far end of the cellar, I saw it. A newly constructed brick wall, the mortar a different color from the rest of the foundation. The wall my grandfather had built. There was a sledgehammer leaning against a nearby rack, left there as if by appointment. It took me the better part of an hour, my arms screaming with the effort, but I smashed a hole in the wall, then another, until I could squeeze through. Behind the wall was a small, separate chamber, and in that chamber sat 20 oak barrels. Each one was marked with a simple, stenciled E.S., Eleanor Sterling. This was it, the Eleanor Reserve, my inheritance. It was beautiful, but a question remained. Was it any good? And even if it was, could 20 barrels of whiskey save me from a $100,000 debt in less than 3 months? I had no idea. But as I stood there in the dark, cool cellar, surrounded by my grandfather's last and greatest work, I felt a flicker of hope that was as potent as the whiskey in the air. Finding the Eleanor Reserve was one thing. Proving its value was another entirely. The barrels were a promise, but right now they were just 20 containers of old liquor in a cellar. I was an 18-year-old kid with no money, no connections, and no knowledge of the spirits industry. The clock was ticking. I called Robert Finch again. I told him about the secret cellar, the 20 barrels. He was intrigued, but cautious. It's a great story, Leo, but stories don't pay off bank liens. We need proof. We need an expert to appraise it. Someone whose word means something in that world. He promised to make some calls, to find a reputable spirits specialist who might be willing to make the trip out to Redemption for a consultation. He warned me it wouldn't be cheap. While I waited, I threw myself into the work. I had the key to the cellar, but the main distillery was still only accessible through the high back window. I needed to get the front door open. The chain was too thick to cut. The lock was a fortress. I spent days studying it, a problem of physics and force. I tried lubricants, crowbars, even the sledgehammer. Nothing worked. It was a monument to my grandfather's determination to keep the world out. Hank from the general store would watch me from a distance on his smoke breaks. He never said much, but one afternoon he ambled over, a thermos of coffee in his hand. "Fighting a losing battle there, kid," he said, not unkindly. "I have to get in," I said, my arms aching, my knuckles raw. He took a long sip of coffee. "Art wasn't a fool. If he chained it like that, he had a reason. You're trying to beat the lock. You should be trying to beat the door." He pointed to the massive steel hinges. They were bolted into the brickwork. "Those bolts are a century old. The brick and mortar around them is the weak point." He was right. I had been so focused on the lock, the symbol of the problem, that I hadn't seen the structural solution. The next day, with a hammer and a cold chisel borrowed from Hank's seemingly endless collection of useful junk, I started chipping away at the mortar around the hinge bolts. It was slow, painstaking work. Each chip of brick felt like a small victory against the past. After 3 days of relentless effort, the top hinge came loose. The massive door sagged, held only by the bottom hinge and the chain. With a final, mighty heave on a crowbar, the bottom bolts gave way, and the entire door, chain and all, crashed outward onto the ground with a sound like thunder. For the first time in 16 years, the front of the Sterling & Son distillery was open. Sunlight streamed into the cavernous space, illuminating the dust and the silent, waiting equipment. I stood there, breathing heavily, covered in brick dust, and felt a profound sense of accomplishment. I hadn't just opened a door, I had broken the seal. A few days later, Robert Finch called. He had found someone. A woman named Isabella Rossi, a legendary figure in the whiskey world. She was a broker, a critic, and a historian. She was also notoriously expensive and selective. "I told her your story," Finch said. "The real one. She was interested. She's agreed to come. But Leo, if this whiskey isn't what you think it is, we're done. This is our one shot." The day Isabella Rossi arrived felt like a final exam. A sleek black car, impossibly clean, pulled up in front of the distillery. A woman in her late 50s, with sharp, intelligent eyes and an air of absolute authority, stepped out. She looked at the crumbling distillery, then at me, a dusty kid in worn-out jeans, and her expression was unreadable. "Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice crisp, "you have my condolences and my curiosity. Show me what you found." I led her inside. She walked through the distillery slowly, her expert eyes taking in every detail: the copper still, the fermentation tanks, the layout of the building. She ran a hand over the tarnished copper, a faint smile on her lips. "He had a Forsyth still," she murmured, more to herself than to me. "Old school. Beautiful." I took her down to the cellar, my heart pounding with every step. I showed her the hole in the wall and the 20 barrels waiting in the dark. She knelt, inspecting the markings. She ran her fingers over the oak staves, smelling the wood. She was silent for a long time. "I'll need a sample," she said finally. "We'll need a whiskey thief and a glass." I had come prepared, having read about the process in Arthur's journal. I had a glass thief, a long copper tube that I'd found in his old tool set. I carefully hammered the bung from the top of one of the barrels. The pop was soft, and the aroma that filled the small chamber was overwhelming. It was rich, complex, a symphony of vanilla, caramel, dark fruit, and something else, a faint, briny note from the coastal air. I dipped the thief into the barrel, drawing out a measure of the dark amber liquid. I poured it into a clean glass. Isabella took the glass, her movements practiced and reverent. She held it to the light of my flashlight, admiring the deep, rich color. She swirled it, watching the legs, the viscous trails it left on the side of the glass. She raised it to her nose, inhaling deeply, her eyes closing for a moment. Then she tasted it. She held the whiskey in her mouth for a long time, her expression intensely focused. The silence in the cellar was absolute. My entire future, my grandfather's entire legacy, hung suspended in that single moment. Finally, she swallowed. She opened her eyes, and they were wide with something that looked like shock, or maybe reverence. She looked from the glass to me. "Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice low and filled with awe. "What your grandfather has done here, it's not just whiskey. It's a masterpiece. The complexity, the balance, the influence of the sea air over 16 years. I've never tasted anything quite like it. This is a time capsule. It's liquid history." "Is it valuable?" I asked, my voice trembling. She let out a short, sharp laugh. "Valuable? Young man, a single bottle of this, properly marketed, could fetch thousands at auction. A single barrel could be worth tens of thousands. You don't have 20 barrels of whiskey here." She gestured to the small, dusty chamber. "You have a legend, and you have your salvation." The weight of her words was so immense it almost brought me to my knees. It was real, all of it. The sacrifice, the hope, the crazy, desperate plan my grandfather had concocted. It had worked. Isabella Rossi became my champion. She saw the story, the incredible narrative of a master distiller's final, secret work, hidden away for his grandson. It was a story the market would devour. She agreed to broker a sale, not of the whole collection, but of just 2 barrels. Her plan was strategic. Sell 2 barrels to a syndicate of high-end collectors she represented. The price would be high enough to generate a buzz, and more importantly, to cover my debt. The remaining 18 barrels would become the foundation of the new Sterling & Son distillery. The news of the sale sent a shockwave through the small town of Redemption. The sum, when it was wired to my account, was astronomical. It was more than enough to pay off Pacific Horizon's lien and all the back taxes, with a substantial amount left over. I walked into the county clerk's office, a certified check in my hand, and cleared the debt on the Sterling property. The clerk, a woman who had looked at me with pity just weeks before, now looked at me with something akin to awe. The property was mine, free and clear. My first call was to Robert Finch. "We did it," I told him, my voice thick with emotion. I could hear the smile in his voice. "No, Leo," he said, "you did it. Your grandfather would be so proud." My second call was to Pacific Horizon Holdings. I got a junior executive on the phone, the same one who had sent me the initial condescending offer. "I'm calling to inform you that the lien on the Sterling property has been satisfied," I said. "We won't be needing your services, or your offers. Please don't contact me again." The stunned silence on the other end of the line was the sweetest sound I had ever heard. The fight was over, but the work was just beginning. I had saved the distillery. Now I had to build it. With the remaining funds, I started the slow, expensive process of restoration. I hired a local crew, men whose fathers had probably worked for my grandfather. Hank, from the store, seemed to know everyone and became my unofficial foreman, pointing me toward the best stonemasons, electricians, and plumbers in the county. We started with the cottage, making it livable. A new roof, new plumbing, a fresh coat of paint. It became my home, a real home. Then we moved on to the distillery itself. We repaired the brickwork, installed new windows, and painstakingly restored the magnificent copper still. I spent every waking moment there, learning the machinery, studying my grandfather's journal, absorbing his knowledge. I wasn't just fixing a building, I was connecting with him, with my own history. I decided the new Sterling & Son would honor the past, but not be trapped by it. We would be a small batch, artisanal distillery, just as he had been. We wouldn't use the Eleanor Reserve for profit. Instead, I bottled it. 250 bottles in total. Each one was hand-labeled. I kept bottle number 1 for myself. The rest I gave away. 1 to Robert Finch, 1 to Isabella Rossi, 1 to Hank. The others went to people in the community, to the men who helped me rebuild, to the archives of whiskey museums. It was never meant to be sold. It was a tribute, a story to be shared, not a commodity. Our first official product was based on one of my grandfather's simpler, classic recipes from the journal. It took months of trial and error, of failures and small successes. The first time I tasted a batch that was truly good, that tasted of the coast and the grain and the hard work, I felt his presence in the room with me, nodding in approval. Word of the distillery's revival, fueled by the legend of the Eleanor Reserve, had spread. When we finally opened our doors for a small tasting event, the whole town of Redemption showed up. So did whiskey aficionados from Portland, Seattle, and beyond. They came for the story, but they stayed for the whiskey. Standing there, in the heart of the bustling, revived distillery, surrounded by the sounds of laughter and clinking glasses, I looked at what we had built. It wasn't just a business. It was a community center. It was a landmark. It was a home. I had started with nothing but a cardboard box and a ghost's legacy. I had inherited a ruin, a debt, and a choice. I chose the harder path, the one that led back into the darkness of the past. But in doing so, I had found not just a future, but a purpose. I often walk through the distillery late at night, after the work is done and the crew has gone home. The air is thick with the sweet smell of mash and aging spirits. I run my hand over the warm copper of the still, the same still my grandfather polished. I think about the word inheritance. It's not about what you're given, it's about what you choose to do with it. My grandfather didn't leave me a fortune. He left me a story, a craft, and the chance to build something that mattered. He gave me a second chance, and in the process, I was able to give him one too. His name is no longer a symbol of ruin, but of resilience. Sterling & Son is alive again, and this time, I am the son. This story, my story, is about rebuilding. It's about looking at a pile of ruins, whether it's a building, a family, or your own life, and having the courage to pick up the first brick. It's about understanding that the heaviest burdens can sometimes become our greatest strengths. Your inheritance might not be a distillery, but we all have one. We all have stories and legacies from our past that we have to choose what to do with. If my story has meant something to you, if it's made you think about your own ruins and your own possibilities for rebuilding, then I'd ask you to do 2 things. First, hit that subscribe button. Become a part of this community.